Welcome to Money Talks. I'm Genevieve Westcott with your latest financial news from across New Zealand and around the globe. Under the spotlight this week, 1 in 7 people in the world go to bed hungry every night. What's the World Bank doing to help? And while Kiwi farmers and consumers live stoically with the volatility of high food prices, how are the poorest people in the world surviving? How much of a difference can New Zealanders really make in eradicating global hunger and poverty through agriculture? We hear from a Kiwi expert who's in the house. So let's talk World Bank. It's got 9,000 employees, operates in more than 100 countries, and it's lent more than $103 billion since the global financial crisis in 2008. It's also gotten back into the business of agriculture, rolling out new technologies and spreading development best practice. Joining me today to tell us more is Hamish, Professor of Agribusiness at Massey University and Director of the Center for Agribusiness Policy and Strategy. Hamish, welcome.
Thank you very much.
You're literally right off a plane from the World Bank in Washington, D.C. What's a university professor doing over there?
The World Bank's engaged with Massey University as part of our Engine of the New Zealand, and they're coming to us for our expertise in agriculture, in business development, and international engagement on a range of the different issues. And so Massey is actually collaborating with the World Bank on a range of projects. You've
been in and out of the World Bank now for the past 3 months. Big ticket on the agenda, food safety.
Food safety and larger ones related to food security. So how do we try and provide safe, affordable food for everyone, everywhere around the world, all the time?
You have an interesting career path. You were educated at Lincoln University,
yes,
but then pretty much went overseas, and you've been working at some big international organizations for the last 22 years. Give me an idea of some of the projects and countries you've been involved in.
Well, that's an interesting question. I've done a lot of work in Eastern Europe when the wall fell down, and then as Latin America opened up, we started working down in Brazil and through Central America, and more recently doing a lot of work through the Middle East and Africa in my last project with Partnerships for Food Development.
Now, looking at food security, what do New Zealand farmers need to take on board from an international perspective?
The interesting one is there's going to be 2 billion people extra by 2050. And that's going to put a lot of pressure on the whole food industry to be able to provide food to them. We have to work out how we can provide affordable and safe food to them. New Zealand won't be able to provide all of that by ourselves. So we're going to have to work out, if New Zealand wants to play in that game on a global basis, work out how we actually start producing food in other countries locally for delivering to those clients in those local countries. And so it's going to require different business models for New Zealand and a different mindset for how New Zealand engages to meet those markets. And they're not the traditional markets. So it's Asia, into Latin America, into the Middle East and Africa, compared to where we traditionally played in Europe and North America.
And for New Zealand farmers, what is our international reputation at the moment? We tend to think that we do things pretty well here.
We do. We're some of the most efficient farmers in the world. Our traditional low-cost production model's been very good in being able to deal with the ups and downs. Interestingly, since I've come back over the last 18 months, I've realised that the business model's changed quite dramatically, and we've now got quite a high-cost, high fixed-cost business model, and so that causes us potentially some interesting difficulties as far as market volatilities go. And if capital markets change and interest rates go up, that may put some pressure into us, but that's not my area of specialty. But I think generally we're recognised as very good.
Now, the World Bank has only gotten back into agriculture in the past few years, correct?
That's correct.
Wouldn't it make more sense for them to be developing other sectors of society than agriculture? Wouldn't there be a bigger bang for their buck in the return?
No, well, no, because the big issue is going to be this food crisis. And if people can't get fed and they can't get safe, affordable food, you're going to have riots on the streets like we saw a couple of years ago. And so we have to work out how we can deliver individuals safe, affordable food. It's not going to be just about agriculture, but it's about moving those rural communities into dual-income households. And so if we can actually help agriculture be more productive, that's a small part of it, but really it's about trying to process that food close to the households and those rural communities so that you can offer second jobs to the woman in the household, whether they're the grandmothers, mothers or the children, and then they can bring 2 or 3 or even 4 incomes back, and that's a steady cash flow as opposed to the seasonal volatility of the agricultural market. And that combination suddenly increases the household wealth substantially with large impact.
Where have the success stories been in the world? Where is this beginning to work?
It's what's interesting is it's a quiet revolution. I think right now at the World Bank, we're in a set of discussions last week about the quiet revolution and how this is actually happening. A lot of it's been driven by foreign direct investment coming in over all of those market reforms over the last 20 years, and foreign companies coming in and creating different business models, which really haven't been that successful, but the locals have adopted key parts of those and then adapted their own models and been very successful. And so the World Bank and others have been looking in the wrong place, and we've suddenly found that there's been this quiet revolution of engagement across this space. And when we look at the real numbers and do the data behind it, there's been substantial impact as far as the wealth of those households go.
But for it to work, you're going to need to get public money, if you like, working hand in hand with private money. Do you have any fear about big multinationals coming into some of the poorest countries in the world and in effect taking over?
They can't take over, right? Because the poor and those individuals own the land, they own the production base, and they don't want to be the producers. So the question becomes is how do you partner up in a way that's a win-win for both sides? So it's not about one taking over the other, it's about working together. And so industry, the local governments, the international organisations and the NGOs are all suddenly realising that we can actually create win-win solutions for everyone that's of benefit to everyone. And industry brings the market.
You've just won a big award for working with some of the poorer countries about how they can adopt, if you like, some of the best practices from some of the big corporations. Tell me about that.
Sure, it's the Food Safety Knowledge Network. It started about 2007. I was in a meeting with a range of the heads of food safety from the major food retailers and food manufacturers around the world, and we were trying to work out how we could find a solution for raising the tide for food safety and safe, affordable food around the world. And I went for a run with the head of Danone's food safety, and we started beating up the ideas, and we suddenly realised that the multinational firms had all of the food safety programs and training capacity in-house. But what they didn't have was a mechanism to be able to take that out to the poor and share that around the world. And so we created the Food Safety Knowledge Network as an open, free mechanism and platform for sharing food safety training and materials to everyone anywhere in the world. So therefore, that lowers the cost, but they get access to best practice built off what industry wants.
Thanks, Hamish. You know, everyone in agribusiness seems to be talking about value chains and how to improve them, but Hamish says what we should really be thinking about are appropriate business models. More when we return. Plus, ASB Chief Economist Nick Tuffley is in the house to bring us up to speed on Greece and the battle over bond repayments. And we discuss China's clampdown on exports and investments in favor of consumption for its 1.3 billion citizens. And that's with a one-child policy. But first, answer this in our Farmers' Facts and Figures quiz. Of all the developing world's rural people, what percentage represents small agricultural households? That's less than 2 hectares, by the way. No Googling allowed. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, of all the developing world's rural people, what percentage represents small agricultural households? The answer, 60% of the developing world's rural people own less than 2 hectares of agricultural land. We're back with Hamish Gow, agribusiness economist with Massey University. Joining us now is Nick Tuffley, ASB's chief economist. Nick, great to see you.
Hello.
We've talked on this show many times about value chains and the importance of them, but is this the right way to go about expanding our business as an agricultural nation?
Yes, well, there's always scope in anything to do things better, and I think the key thing in agriculture also is in our customer base offshore for our exports, looking at the customer's needs and how we can better add the value here, meet the needs better ourselves, rather than exporting raw materials. So we're able to capture more of that value that the end customer is paying for.
Perhaps we've got to be changing our business models. We concentrate too much on value chains and we're not bigger picture. Tell me more about that.
Well, I don't look at the world as a chain. It's actually a system, and the question becomes is how do we build business models through those systems so that we can work within the system and the parts that allow us to be able to capture and clip the ticket to deliver the greatest value back to us here. And we really need to understand what's going on with consumers and start on the consumer and work back. A lot of time when people talk about value chains, they still start at the farmer and it's a production push, and we need to turn that on its head.
50 years from now, where do you think New Zealand farmers should be in the world?
Look, you can see over the next several decades at least that there is huge scope for our farmers to be serving Asia in particular, where a lot of the growth will tend to be, that we can at least see over the next 10 to 20 years. There's also, I guess, putting aside just our own production, but one thing that we are very good at it is all the innovation and the technology and the ideas behind it as well. And there may, that sort of intellectual property, and there may well be scope to be applying that not just in Asia but in Africa and other places where there's a lot of catch-up to come through.
Now that's interesting, because that's exactly what you argue, Hamish. Tell me about that.
I agree with Nick. I think the real opportunity in the future is working out how we have our technology and farming systems get adapted and integrated into the farming systems elsewhere in the world, and we start producing in those countries for those domestic markets. New Zealand will, if we double production in New Zealand, we'll still only be able to feed 40 million people in the world. Right now we feed 20. So if we really want to go and feed the world, we've got to take our farming systems and integrate them into other farming systems around the world and work out how we do weightless exports. Grasslands, which is a group of farmers out of mid-Canterbury, right now are working with the University of Missouri in North America, creating a model farm for partial production. They're also working with farmers in Chile and Brazil. And so we've got farmers out there already engaging in this space. We've got banks coming in to support them with innovative financing mechanisms. The really interesting one is how can we actually go and build the appropriate value chains or business models around that to really ensure that they can extract the greatest amount of value and return that back to New Zealand and provide mechanisms to facilitate and support that.
It may be happening offshore, but not in any large degree. Is it your view that that really is going to have to change, that this is where we're really going to have to be if we want to survive as an agricultural nation?
I would argue it is starting to happen. I think Fonterra is already building farms in China, they're building farms in Brazil and other places. I think the dairy industries recognise that. I think the other industries are starting to recognise that, and we've just got to change the way we do business, and it's a mindset change. But the leadership in New Zealand is already starting to make that change. Whether the whole general public's made that leap yet is a different story.
And yet we still hear from the political leadership here, John Key, you know, the answer certainly short term is in exports. Let's increase our exports. But is that big picture enough? Should he be taking a longer view?
Well, I think it comes down to what you call exports at the moment. Yes, there's a lot of focus on perhaps the goods, but what we also have to think about what we can supply the rest of the world is those services. And earning, what it's all about is earning a dollar from offshore. And you know, if we look at our current exports, say out of the agricultural sector, it's very focused on the land and the domestic production, and we're only going to be able to boost that at a certain amount, and there'll be some limitations on how much of New Zealand we can turn into one big farm. If we're wanting to really build on our strength, which is agriculture, keep a dominant role in the agricultural markets like Fonterra, we do need to start looking offshore for either the production there or exporting our knowledge and making money out of, you know, our intellectual property as well.
What kind of intellectual property do you think we'll be able to sell the rest of the world when it comes to things like food security?
Well, what we have is a great model where, apart from the advantage that we have of being able to feed animals quite cleanly through grass, and it's all natural, but it's all that systems through the quality control and the production, right through to what you know almost the end product that we're actually on selling to the customer, and having those rigorous processes in place. And I think that's what is lacking in a lot of places, particularly more developing countries as well, where your levels of hygiene aren't as high, and the systems. And I think what you bring is the rigour in the systems, and also, you know, you're increasingly seeing in New Zealand that farming is being run like a very, I guess, a very scientific business, in a sense that there is so much technology that you can be applying to really understand what you are doing and make incremental improvements on a given farm through the monitoring systems that are there, for example. So there's a wide range of, I think, advantages that New Zealand does have, on top of the fact that we just happen to have great grass growth and, you know, lots of water and those blessings that we get from nature.
Generally around the world there's a very positive gain and feel in agriculture. Agriculture is booming everywhere around the world. People have to get fed. It's one of those industries that it doesn't matter whether there's a global recession or not, people still have to eat. The challenge for the other industries is that loss of disposable income that which will get used on other things, that then gets used if prices go up on food.
we're limited here as to what we can accomplish. We're going to have to be building those satellites around the world. Are New Zealanders ready to do that?
That's an interesting question. I challenged my class when I got back yesterday about what they were going to do after they'd finished university. And they all said, well, hopefully we'll get a job working for one of the banks because they pay the most, and then that'll give us enough money to go on OE. And I said, well, where do you want to go on OE? And the class went, London. I went, eh. Then they said, North America, eh. And then they asked me, why? I said, well, the growth opportunities are in Asia, Southern Asia, Central Europe, Middle East, Africa, Latin America. Those are the places where all our students should be going on their OE and spending time there, not just as a tourist, but actually living and immersing themselves for 2 or 3 years. And when they come back, that'll increase their viability and their ability to be able to get the right types of jobs, so they'll have this innate knowledge and understanding about how those markets operate, what the customs are, where the opportunities are for selling food, what the dynamics are, the networks and relationships in those different marketplaces, plus the languages. And so suddenly the students were sitting there and going, just a minute, we've been thinking the wrong way about this. And so we have to really think about how we change the way that we're training our students. All the way from primary school, we should be getting them to learn languages, but languages that are required for the markets of the future, not the markets of the past. And how we get those students out and immerse them in those marketplaces, which are, they're fearful of it. It's a different culture, it's a different language, the people look different. There's a large opportunity of students coming in here who want to come here to be transformed and go through a transformational process. We should do that. We should engage it with industry. We should get them out on the farms, and so then they can become the practitioners on the field which drive those new business models, whether we're producing locally for the local markets in those international markets.
And speaking of international markets, one of the most important ones for us, of course, is going to be China. We'll talk about the state of play in China when we return. Thanks, gentlemen. Coming up after the break, future-proof on the highways and byways of the economic world, as our experts point out what's coming up. But first, answer this in our Farmers' Facts and Figures quiz. How many extra liters of milk will be produced annually in Europe when its dairy quotas are lifted in 2015? Come back quick. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, how many extra liters of milk will be produced annually in Europe when its dairy quotas are lifted in 2015? An additional 9 billion litres, according to Rabobank, with more than a third of it sold to the EU, followed by the Middle East and Russia. Seems it won't be competing in our main export markets of Southeast Asia and China. That's good to know. Speaking of China, their growth is slowing. What's going on over there, Nick?
Well, in the short term, their growth has been moderating, but I think one of the key announcements we had this week was that they are dropping their growth target for this year from 8% to 7.5%. Now, they have these 5-year plans, and I should say the 5-year target is 7% for the next 5 years. And in the past, when they've had these targets, they've tended to grossly overshoot by, a good couple of % or so. So I don't think we should get too worried about the fact that they've dropped their growth target slightly for this year. In actual fact, most forecasts are still above 8%.
Yeah, and they're really worried about exports, and they're hoping to encourage a lot more consumerism, if you like, among their own citizens. They're also up for a new leader later in the year. How do you think that's going to affect how business is done in China?
Well, there is, I think, a lot of change coming from in China. Now, if you look at China and the US, they're kind of mirror images. The US spend too much of other people's money. The Chinese make far more than what they consume and save and lend it on. So China's got to try and rebalance its economy a little bit. Its financial system is quite tightly controlled, so the allocation of capital was pretty inefficient. Interest rates are probably artificially low, so that constrains the sort of savings incomes that people get in China as well. And despite it being a communist country, so purportedly, it's the capital that tended to get quite a large share of the profits that were being made. So there is an effort to want to transform it and get a bit more balance within the economy, a lot less, say, over-investment, perhaps inefficient investment, and a bit more consumer spending. I can only see that as good for New Zealand if we start to see consumerism taking a larger share of the Chinese economy, because a lot of our exports are ultimately focused, particularly the agricultural ones, on the consumer. So if we get much sharper growth in consumer spending, a lot more income going through to consumers, look, we're only going to really benefit strongly from that. So I see that balancing of the Chinese economy is a healthy thing for our exports, but it's also a healthy thing for the global economy, where you can't have these big imbalances keep on going as they have been for the last decade or so.
We'll come back and talk about Greece, but first here at home, of course, all eyes on the Reserve Bank tomorrow. Alan Bollard with the latest monetary policy statement. No changes expected.
No changes expected. I think the governor is probably dusting off his golf clubs or whatever he does. He's retiring in September from the Reserve Bank, effectively.
He's out of here.
So,
yeah.
But look, I think rates on hold. I think we're likely to see some more encouraging signs out of the Reserve Bank that the global economy is stabilising a bit. Some of the risks in Europe have receded. Our dollar has been climbing, and that is an issue, and that does will eat into our export returns a little bit. Domestically, we're seeing the housing market looking okay and retail spending looking okay. So there's a mix of factors in there, but we think it's
still going to be a long, slow grind, isn't it?
Yes.
Long, slow grind.
Gradual recovery, and no need for lifting interest rates right now.
We hope, if the rest of the world doesn't implode. Speaking of which, at the World Bank, what's the gossip about Europe and the Greek situation? Is it going to be resolved? Because apparently now the private creditors are saying to the Greek government, we're not going to necessarily take that haircut that you want us to take. What's the latest?
I can't talk about what's going on as far as that goes, but the Europeans are still investing in dealing with food security issues around the world, so things are ticking on everywhere else around the world, and the Europeans are engaging. So
what we do know is that the World Bank is looking for a new leader, and what are you hearing there?
Jeffrey Sachs has put his hand up in that.
Now, this is a guy that Time magazine has called the most famous economist in the world. He's kind of a high flyer and a bit of a celebrity.
He would be one of the celebrity economists around the world. Whether he's the right person for the World Bank is a different story. I think there's a lot of debate that will go on in the public arena to find out who the right person is in that space. I think you need to have someone who can bring industry and government and international organisations together to create a different model for the World Bank into the future. I think the World Bank internally is trying to work out what that looks like, and it's a difficult decision to get the right person in that space to make sure that you can bring everyone together. The dynamics of the world have changed over the last 10 years.
Changed in what sense?
Power's shifted, economic growth shifted, the US and European economies are not doing as well as they were 10 years ago, and the Asian economies are doing really, really well. Middle East is starting to do well. Africa's looking up. Latin America's looking up. And so there's a totally different dynamic going on around the world, and the different political balances and power balances across that.
We may not even have an American head of the World Bank, although that's been traditional.
That's an interesting question.
Who knows? Watch this space.
Right.
Just very quickly, what's your take on the fact that the former Prime Minister of Iceland now is facing criminal charges for letting his country implode after the global financial crisis?
Probably a good thing.
It is a good thing. You think he should be held accountable?
Everyone should get held accountable. It's good governance.
Some say that it shouldn't only be the Prime Minister. Perhaps some of his other senior ministers should be in the dock as well.
That's quite possible. It's happening here as well for bad governance in different financial institutions.
Yeah, so the age of accountability is maybe upon us.
You dead right.
Nick, what's your take on it? What do you think of them hauling the former Prime Minister into the dock on criminal charges?
I have to say I haven't followed it closely, but I'd say there's probably a lot of, I guess, culpability in Iceland. You had a banking system that not only lent about 9 times Iceland's economy, but was also allowed to by regulators. People in Iceland were quite happy to borrow huge amounts of money to buy flash cars and the like. So I think there's a lot of widespread blame, but there's been some pretty eyebrow-raising issues, I think, between the finance sector and the whole government.
Thanks to my guests, Nick Tuffley and Hamish Gow. Be sure to check out our website for all the latest news and hot new programs. By the way, I hope you're busy rounding up your mates for next week's St. Patrick's Day celebrations. What? Finding it hard to get them to commit? You might want to try this approach.
Well, here we are. We're all set for the St. Patrick's Day sheepdog trials. It's a capacity crowd of 16. And first up is Gareth Longgrass with his border collie Roy, 3-time winner here.
Away to me.
He's a great competitor, this one. He's a legend in Gloucestershire, but we're in Yorkshire today, so that counts for nothing. Jim? Jim?
He's taking a lovely wide berth there, being very careful not to spook them. This is a good start.
Yes, 10 out of 10 for the outrun. That's great work there from the young dog. They're bang on course for where they want to go. This lad is a wizard at whistling.
And he's got them all through.
Lovely stuff. Textbook herding right there, all over them, like a rash. Who is your daddy? That's what the dog is saying. Look and learn.
Keep the faith. See you next time.